Donald Trump has surrendered more times than we can count, beginning with Mexico paying for the wall. He surrendered to Mexico on that immediately after taking office and got on the phone to beg the president of Mexico to stop talking about it so that the Trump surrender on Mexico paying for the wall could quietly fade away. Today, Donald Trump's surrender is a big one. And so in true Trump style, he had it delivered by someone you've never heard of deep inside the Justice Department. Kate Bailey, whose title is Trial Attorney, United States Department of Justice, Civil Division, Federal Programs Branch. It was her job to announce today that Donald Trump will not try to defy the Constitution and delay the census for the first time in history, and that the census will go forward without Donald Trump's question about citizenship. She wrote an email saying, "We can confirm that the decision has been made to print the 2020 decennial census questionnaire without a citizenship question, and that the printer has been instructed to begin the printing process." When Donald Trump lost in the Supreme Court last week, he pretended he wasn't giving up. He pretended that he might delay the census, which would be as wildly unconstitutional as Donald Trump refusing to leave office if he loses the Electoral College. And there are people who think that Donald Trump just might do that he's just such a crazy tough guy that he'll just stay in the White House if he loses the election and somehow hold on to the presidency. He won't. He's not a tough guy. Donald Trump surrenders much more often than he wins, and he surrenders completely, as he did today. That's the general important lesson of today. Donald Trump does not dare to defy the Supreme Court, and Donald Trump does surrender, and surrender completely. Here's Donald Trump yesterday lying about the possibility that he would delay the census.
We'll be delaying the census, the Supreme Court on the census.
Yeah, we're looking at that. You go through all this detail, and you're not allowed to ask whether or not somebody is a citizen. So you can ask other things, but you can't ask whether or not somebody's a citizen. So we are trying to do that. We're looking at that very strongly.
Looking at that very strongly to delay the census. No, he isn't. Less than 24 hours later, Donald Trump allowed a Justice Department lawyer to announce he stopped looking at it very strongly, and he is completely surrendering to the Supreme Court decision, ordering the census to go forward without a citizenship question. Neal Katyal is one of the lawyers who got Donald Trump to surrender this time by beating Donald Trump in the United States Supreme Court on the census case. And he joins us now. Neal Katyal is a former acting Solicitor General in the Obama administration and an MSNBC legal contributor. And Neal, I have to bring you up to date on the breaking news at 10:33 p.m. Just minutes ago, the president has tweeted again on this. He said, a very sad time for America when the Supreme Court of the United States won't allow a question of, is this person a citizen of the United States, to be asked on the 2020 census, going on for a long time. I have asked the Department of Commerce and the Department of Justice to do whatever is necessary to bring this most vital of questions and this very important case to a successful conclusion. And then, for some inexplicable reason, he says USA exclamation point 3 times. Neal, as I understand it, apparently no one has told the president that the case has reached a successful conclusion.
Yeah, it's a thoroughly odd tweet, and it's very similar to the tweet he issued last week when he lost at the Supreme Court. And that was a really resounding loss, Lawrence. And so before getting into the tweet today, it's important for your viewers to know what happened. So last week, the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts, said that President Trump's rationale for putting the citizenship question on the census was, quote, contrived. I mean, that's a remarkable thing for a Chief Justice of the United States to accuse a president of. And then the president last week and now again today in these tweets is saying, well, maybe we can delay the census, or suggesting that. And, you know, your whole lead up to this question, the segment you were showing, was all about how, well, the president has surrendered on this. And it sure looked that way until this tweet 15 minutes ago. And that's good that he surrendered. I mean, we should applaud a president who follows Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, which has been around since 1789 and requires a census every 10 years. So I can't really make too much of the tweet, Lawrence. It's very hard to tell what it really means, but I do think it's indicative of just the way this president governs, which is really not to govern, but to tweet. This is a guy who's tweeter-in-chief, not commander-in-chief. He doesn't really like governing. He just issues these missives, has no real idea what his own Justice Department is doing on this, and the proof is in the pudding. So today, the Justice Department came in, told a federal court, we're printing the census right now, and it's not going to include the citizenship question.
Well, there's a very important element to Trump surrenders, and that is that there's a performance art piece that continues in which he pretends he didn't surrender. So, for example, on the wall, on the shutdown with Nancy Pelosi, he's completely shut out on the wall. And then he goes to rallies and tells people, we're building the wall. And so this tweet, I think, lives in that family of Trump expression where the case has reached a successful conclusion. There's nothing to be done with that case. The Supreme Court has heard it and ruled. And the president continues to tweet about the case. That fits a Trump model.
Yeah, so it's a model or lives in a family. I think the word I'd prefer is delusional. But, either way, you can say it in either respect. I think the difference with Mexico or something like that is very few Americans will go to the border and see that there is no wall or things like that. Every American is going to see the census questions in the next year, and they will all know. And it'll be clear as day that there's no citizenship question on there. And there's a United States Supreme Court ruling, which is just extraordinary. No president had this in history. You really got to try to get the Chief Justice and his colleagues to accuse you of being conjectural and pretextual in your reasoning. But that's what President Trump managed to do already in just a couple of years of being president. That is, it says something about President Trump. It also says something about our United States Supreme Court, which has said effectively in this opinion to Donald Trump, look, you can lie to the American people, you can talk about the wall or this or that and the promises, but don't you dare lie to the federal judiciary. And that's what you did in this case.
And just to be clear to the audience, the Census Bureau has other methods of surveying the American people about different things, including citizenship. They just don't do it in the 10-year census. And so they keep a pretty good count of how many people in this country are citizens and how many people in this country are not. So it's not a mysterious number that's otherwise unavailable.
That's 100% right, Lawrence. And I think the most important thing is that the Census Bureau itself has said, if you ask this question about citizenship, it's going to depress minority turnout, and you're actually going to get a skewed result. Those are impartial, non-political people. They're the career experts who are saying that in Trump's own Commerce Department, which administers the census. And so that's why the Supreme Court, I think, was so concerned with this, blatant attempt by President Trump at the last minute to add this thing for reasons that he claimed were about the Voting Rights Act, when I think President Trump doesn't even know that there is a Voting Rights Act, so it's like a little hard to see it.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.